if you were with us last week. We're back at it again. So good evening. We're with Ask Eddie Kramer.
Hi,
guitars.
How are you doing?
And as many of you know, I'm sure if you're tuned in, Eddie is one of our, I'll say, an international treasure. The man has recorded some of the greatest music, over the past 50 years. If you know Led Zeppelin 2, if you know Are You Experienced, if you know Kiss Alive, this is the man that got it all down on tape for us. And today we're here speaking to him about the Woodstock Music Festival. And for the younger people out there that don't know what that is, it was a 3-day music festival with all the greatest rock musicians of the time. And there was supposed to be like maybe 50, 60,000 people, but then 300,000 people descended at the festival in New York, in Woodstock, and then it rained. So it was, it was a legendary festival. Some people call it one of the greatest music events of all time. Other people call it a total and utter disaster. We'll find out from the man who was there and recorded it all what the real story is about Woodstock. How you doing, Eddie?
Doing great. Doing great. Just to follow up on that lovely intro, thank you so much. Thank you, Gibson, everybody there. It's wonderful to be back and doing number 3. And it's very exciting, you know. I get really excited when you ask these questions about what happened 50 plus years ago, and it's still fresh in the memory. It gets burned into those memory banks. But I remember the number of people a little bit differently. I believe it was closer to 500,000, which is what the New York State folks said. And when they flew over with the helicopter, they made some sort of numbers based on what they saw. It was stunning. I have to say, when I walked out on stage for just prior to the actual event, and standing next to me was it's a whole bunch of folks from the Fillmore East, and we looked at each other and said, wow, okay, if they riot, we are screwed. And I went right back to my truck. Yeah, Bill Graham said that to me. He whispered in my ear, hey, Kramer, if these folks decide to riot, So
Run!
I said, thank you, Bill. I'm going back to my truck where I know it's safe. But that never happened because everybody was, very relaxed, shall we say.
3 days of peace, love, and music. Something like that.
No. For me, it was 3 days of drugs and hell.
Well, first question is, you knew what was going on. It was going to be 3 days straight of many, many different bands. How do you prepare for such a thing?
Let's back it up a little bit, because how did I get there? Because it was a request from the film folks who let's call this guy Kramer at the record plant. He's working with Hendrix. Hendrix is going to be the big star. He's going to, end the whole thing. And it's one of the main attractions. And he does a lot of great recordings. So whatever, let's call him and see if he wants to record the thing. And I get this phone call actually from the film guys. And they just said, hey, we got this festival, 60, 70, maybe 100,000 people at the very most. It's going to be in Woodstock. Should be a lot of fun. Jimmy's, going to close the show. I said, yeah, I'd love to do it. And I arrived there on the Friday morning. We left New York City, I think, at about 4 a.m. Get there about 6. You couldn't move when you got within a mile of the site. It was just packed. The throughways were basically going to be closed down within the next hour or so. So we parked the car and walked the last mile. to
Oh,
the
wow.
site. And I remember walking along and then coming to this little hill, and we walked up this little hill and looked down at this beautiful site of a stage being constructed with cranes overhead pulling in these massive beams. This was like 6:30, 7 o'clock in the morning. I figured, okay, wait a minute. In about 3 or 4 hours, we're going to have a show. Well, the good news is that, like I said earlier, the guys from the Fillmore East, the whole crew, they came up. They absolutely were amazing putting that stage together, and by the time we were running.
How many people did you have working with you to change around mics and all that different stuff between the bands?
Good number of people. I think we had all of the audio guys, I said, from the Fillmore East. It was a little bit chaotic, but we got it done. It was run around, change this cable, move this one and that. But there were some other interesting things that were going on at the same time. There was a platform, a circular platform, which was divided into two halves. Band number one goes on the front half. Band number two is loading their gear on the back half. And it had wheels on. The idea was turn this whole movable platform around, and then it's nice and easy. After the first band was on and they turned it, all the bloody wheels fell off. And they just sat there for the whole 3 days.
I remember hearing Jerry Garcia from the Grateful Dead talking about how at one point he thought that the whole stage was going to collapse. Was that?
That's what he was referring to. It was that. The stage itself was fantastic. The stage it was sitting on was fabulous. That was really well built. But it was this turntable idea that just went cock-a-plump.
Well, I want to make sure that we get our home audience involved. I want questions, guys. I want you to be able to jump in here. So let's just take a quick one right now. I'm sorry, I got to put my glasses here. Maurice Evans says, what was it like working with the gear in that weather? Because it was raining, right?
Immediately that the big storm came in, tops were thrown over all the gear. The PA was still working. It was a miracle no one got electrocuted. But I don't think anybody was actually playing in the rain. I mean, I think Joe Cocker just pretty much finished his act, and then that storm just came ripping through. Front of house was working. The announcements were made. People pulled stuff over their heads. Tops were thrown over quickly. And after the storm, everybody sort of brushed it off, and we plugged in, and away we went again.
Now most of those bands that played Woodstock sort of went on to become huge legends. Were there bands that you weren't familiar with that just blew you away?
I'd never actually seen Santana. That was one who I really enjoyed. I thought it was a fantastic set, and it made their career, that's for sure. Joe Cocker I'd known because I'd worked with him in England and also at the record plant in New York in '68, the year before. Came in through the bathroom window. We did there at the record plant, so I was pretty familiar with him. But I think the occasion of Woodstock and the response from the audience so fantastic. These guys they're up there and they're playing their hearts out. And can you imagine the response from like 500,000 people? It was just fantastic. Yeah, Santana, definitely. It
was one of the first gigs for Crosby,
strangeness with Santana's show in the beginning, but that may be a story for another time. Johnny Winter.
Oh yeah.
Certainly, I mean, The Who was great.
Janis Joplin.
It was, but it never came out, did it? I mean, it was like
no.
that went on with that. And then, Jimmy comes on the Monday morning, which we've talked about already in one of our previous shows, 9 a.m. in the morning. He was supposed to have gone on at, I think, 1 or 2 in the morning on the Sunday night, but that never happened. And most of the people had gone. It was only 60, 70,000, maybe 100,000 at the very, very most there.
I want to basically come back and talk a little bit more in depth about Jimmy later, if we could.
Sure.
While you were recording, were you able to? I know this sounds like a crazy question, but while you were recording and so busy dealing with all of the different problems and different things that were going on stage, were you actually able to listen and enjoy any of the music?
There were a couple of breaks that I had in between. I would run out and have a listen and come back to the truck. We were pretty much on 12, 14, 16 hours. There was another engineer we traded off at times. Certainly it was all hands on deck when there was a changeover. And that became its own little nightmare because pretty soon after the first few bands, the communication system that we had was gone, So I would stand, I was in a truck, the back of a tractor trailer truck with the two 8-track machines. And I would stand in the doorway, 300 feet, maybe even more behind the stage. And I would stand there and wave and give this signal, 1 or 2 or 5 or something. Plug that in, that was the only way. And then we would send a runner over, and it was crazed. It was really a lot of craziness.
What were the obviously while you were recording 3 days of this madness, when you finished recording all of it and got back and listened to it, were you pleasantly surprised or
I don't know if I was pleasantly surprised. I mean, I knew that we had it. It was rough, and also remember 8 tracks. Track 7 was audience. Track 8 was a pulse tone to sync up the cameras. So you only had 6 tracks in which to put all of the audio information of all the music. So you really had to think, okay, well, maybe it's definitely going to be a mono drum track. And then we're going to have to put maybe the bass and some of the guitars. It was just craziness trying to figure out who's who, what's what. And the lack of communication just made things very challenging. I mean, look, in the end, it sounded great. I've had the opportunity to remix Jimmy's portion a couple of times, and it's phenomenal. I mean, there was an object lesson in playing guitar, but we'll get back to that later.
Well, I guess we're there. So let's talk about it. But I wanted to sort of set up the, set the stage, so to speak, for the audience out there. It was a very interesting time in Jimi Hendrix's career. He had already been up in Woodstock rehearsing with essentially a new band. Can you tell us a little bit about what was going on there with Jimmy?
Well, I think this was a crossroad point for Jimmy. He wanted to expand his musical horizon. He wanted a bigger band, and the year of '69 was a year of change for him, and this was him trying to figure out what his next move was going to be musically. So he brought in a bunch of percussion players, and he brought in Larry Lee, his buddy. And
Larry Lee, for you guys out there, was a actual rhythm guitar player, which Jimmy never really had done before.
Never had, right.
Yeah.
This was him. Jimmy was thinking, okay, I want a bigger band. So bring an extra guitar player, percussion. Let's see if we can do this. And they rehearsed at Woodstock down the road in a house near Woodstock. And they performed. I mean, it was, some parts were pretty loose. Other parts were absolutely stunning. So
yeah,
what can I say? There are some great comments here, and I'd like to pick up on. Somebody asked, it's a comment from Michael Garcia. How many watts was the PA, and was there any low end to speak of? Very good question. Bill Hanley was the guy who put his PA system up. It's the same system that was in the Fillmore East, and it was very well done, actually. Surprisingly enough, the two towers. You always, if you're looking at the Woodstock movie, get off the towers. You know, you always hear people they're like ants crawling up these massive 40-foot towers. It was surprising. There was actually some reasonable low end. I do remember, I could do a very fast, quick story about around about 12 noon before we started on the Friday. I walked over to where Bill Hanley's little shack, he had this little tiny tin shack with a sloping roof on it, so the rain didn't come in. And he's inside with his console where all the microphones come into. And all I see is the back of him with a console propped up with a big piece of wood. And he's in the console soldering stuff and the smoke coming out. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, we're going to be live. But he did. He got it together. It was funny.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So how was that experience different than, now you've recorded a bunch of great live records. I don't know if everybody out there is quite aware of all the really brilliant live records you've done. You know, in addition to Song Remains the Same, which we talked about last week, Eddie also did Frampton Comes Alive, one of the biggest selling records of all time. There's Kiss Alive. There's a Derek and the Dominoes record with Eric Clapton. How was recording Woodstock different than how you would normally approach recording one of those great records?
Well, the big difference is that the truck that we would be using at the time, there were a couple of them, but the one that I fondly remember is a truck called the Fedco truck, and it would always be pulling up to the back of the Fillmore East where I did quite a few recordings. It was a little bread truck, but it had two 16-track machines in it, which was wonderful. After the fact, you know, after the 8-track stuff, of course, we got 16, which was great. But that's an organized situation. You get in the day before, you run all the lines, you make sure everything's cool, you have a split feed, you know, that would give you the signal that would go to the PA, and one half goes to the recording truck. And you always have your crew on hand, there's somebody on the side of the stage with a pair of headphones, and hey, that mic just got kicked over, go and put it back, you know, that kind of stuff. That's what you have. And they also have the advantage of recording over maybe a 2-day period. Maybe the band's going to be there the next night. Right. But generally speaking, it's organized, whereas Woodstock was organized chaos.
But you've had your share of chaotic experiences in recording live records. You were telling me a story the other day about recording Kiss Alive and yes. Running into some problems in New Jersey. Maybe you could tell our audience about that.
You're always going to find problems in New Jersey if you look for it. So the decision to record Kiss is another story in itself, but the decision was made. We decided to book, or maybe let me back up. I think it was management who decided we're going to record way down at the bottom end of New Jersey. It's near Cape May. It's this funky little town. It's a boardwalk town. And they had like 1,000, maybe it was a 1,200-seater theater. I don't know if you can even call it a theater, but it was a building. We drove the truck down, once again, the Fedco truck, and started setting up. And one of the crew guys comes to me and says, you know, there's a little problem. They have a PA, but it's not on anything. It's just hanging out on the floor. And they're looking for a way of raising it up somehow. And one of the crew guys from Kiss comes over and says, I know where we can get some stuff let's go to that building site over there. Let's get some scaffolding. So we're in New Jersey. You don't mess around in New Jersey. So they went over to this building site and they stole a whole bunch of the scaffolding. Drag it back to the club, set it up, put the PA on there. And, the show was about to go on at 7 o'clock at night. And the place is packed and the audience is going to go nuts. Bill Coyne's in the dressing room with the band. And the agent or the guy who was in the building thinking he's going to control everything, he's the man with the money. Bill Coyne says, unless you give me my money now, this band does not go on, and you don't want to know what's going to happen to this venue if that crowd gets nuts. Oh, okay, and finally he gets paid, and the show goes on, and we could record.
I love the idea that here it is, they're planning to record a live record, and none of this is organized. The PA system isn't working. They have to steal from a construction site. that just kills me. What can you tell us about, like, one of my favorite guitar records of all time? One of the best sounding guitar records, period, was Humble Pie, Rockin' at the Fillmore. Now that might not be as huge as some of the other records you've done, but it's a fabulous sounding record, and it was done with a lot of Gibson guitars. So you guys go out there and get it if you haven't heard it. But I'm curious if you have any memories of recording Steve Marriott and Peter Frampton in Humble Pie.
Yes, that was also, once again, with our fabulous little Fedco truck, bread truck. And it is the sound of the hall. That Fillmore East, because of the way the stage was built, I mean, it was probably, the building was built around about the same time as Carnegie Hall. And they all had the same kind of basic principle. There's oak floor like this, and then there's another piece that goes this way. So the stage is actually acts like a plenum. So when the bottom end is hitting it, it sort of moves like this, very imperceptibly, but nevertheless, it's a suspended stage in essence. And you could put up any mic you wanted, 3 mics if you wanted, and the sound, the acoustics of that room were phenomenal. Then, of course, you got this incredibly out of their mind audience. They're just going nuts. And a band which is phenomenal. Steve Marriott's voice, incredible, just one of the rock voices of all time. Peter Frampton, another fantastic, brilliant musician. And the whole band was just rocking. And then they had their manager, Dee Anthony, behind the scenes with a big whistle, and he was like their cheerleader, cheering them on. It was an exciting performance. I mean, we took that I Don't Need No Doctor, which was maybe 13 or 14 minutes long. Great performance, but they wanted to make it a single. I remember we were back at Electric Lady mixing, and I had chopped that 13, 14 minutes down to like 3 minutes. And there's bits of tape everywhere in the control room, and we did it. I mean, that's the way you did it. You cut tape.
Let's go to our audience again. Jean Burford asks, what was the highlight of the entire spectacle for you? I guess they're referring to Woodstock.
Right, that'd be yeah. Wow, surviving it maybe.
Nice.
I know what you're saying. I have to keep going back to Jimmy, unfortunately, but fortunately for me, just to be present when he plays the Star Spangled Banner. I mean, there are very few things of in recorded history where you just go, "Oh my God, this is really happening!" It's an incredible rendition. That, thank God, it was caught on film and on tape. That sticks in the mind. But the whole thing in this truck, so many hours, you come out, you get something to eat, you go to the bathroom, whatever, rain, pushing cars out of the mud. I mean, it all blends together. Oh, I've got something. You won't ever want to have this happen. So, I didn't take any drugs. And they offered these vitamin B12 injections. Oh, yeah, okay, fine. Take your pants down. Boom, in the bum. Christ almighty, did that hurt. Jesus. It was horrendous. But it kept you going. And cups of tea, if I could ever find a bloody cup of tea.
It was a little bit of pain, but it probably got you through the whole thing, got you through the ordeal.
Whatever gets you through the night.
Douglas Stepanek asks, which group was the biggest challenge to record?
Tough one.
Well, there is that Santana story.
Why not? All right. It wasn't so much it was tough to record the band. The recordings of the band were tremendous, but the aftermath, when we got the tapes back many years later, I was asked to revisit the first two Santana songs because they were slightly unusable because of the tuning. And it turns out they were supposed to go on at 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock in the day or something quite late. And so the band had, I believe, dropped a bunch of acid in the morning thinking, it would be cool by the time, we get to play. Something happened in the performances of other bands, and they said, the folks that were in charge said, guys, you got to go on now. This was like at 12 noon or 1 o'clock. And most of the band was still like seriously high, including Carlos.
Yeah.
And I had fixed all this stuff many, many years later. It was about 4 or 5 years ago, whenever it was, we fixed the out-of-tune stuff. And he said to me after we'd finished it, he said, do you know why I was so out of tune? I said, no. I said, well, I dropped a bunch of acid. I said, oh my God, I had no idea. He said, yeah, man. When I walked up on stage and I picked up my guitar and I looked at it, there were snakes coming out of the strings. And he said, man, I pray to God.
It's a good excuse. It's a good excuse.
Yeah, I pray to God, please let me play in time and in tune. I'll never take another drug. You're right, I lied. That's what he said. But there you go. Hey, those things happen.
We talked a little bit about Janis Joplin, and at that point in her career, she had a fairly big band. She had a few horn players, a couple of guitar players, bass player. How did you, with only 6 tracks to work with, how did you go about getting that on tape?
That's the same basic principle. I mean, you keep the drums separate, try and keep the bass separate if you can, and then you just have to start combining as many things as you possibly can. You got to blend guitar parts. You obviously keep her vocals separate. Whatever you can, the trick here is to find compatible instruments that will go together and work together, and make sure you get that balance just right.
Well, there's a couple of interesting questions from our audience. Jeff Kiefer wants to know whether Jimmy was frustrated that he was the headliner and ended up playing to a lot less people, because the reason that Jimmy ended up playing to a lot less people,
scheduling and the weather,
of the weather.
Yes. I think he may have been frustrated, but I think Jimmy was such a great show. Excuse me. Sorry. Mm-hmm. No, I was just going to say, I think that the reason that he may have been frustrated but didn't show it is he's a pro.
Yeah.
And he was using this more as almost like a rehearsal in front of what he thought was going to be half a million people, but it wasn't. Maybe he was fortunate in the end. There was only 60, 100,000 people there. I think he used it as a way to work out some stuff, what worked and what didn't work. It was kind of an expensive way of doing it, but that's Jimmy, you know.
Ultimately, it sort of didn't really work out for him. I mean, after the experience of Woodstock with the big band, he ended up going back to a trio format. You know,
but I think he went back to but I think he went back to the trio format for a very specific reason, because right after Woodstock, within a month or so, he was rehearsing the Band of Gypsies. And the clue to that, he even says it in the show, at the beginning of the show, we're nothing but a band of gypsies. He had a commitment that he had to live up to, a recording contract, you know, and he had to deliver an album. So he figured, all right, I'll put a live album out. And he brought in Buddy Miles, and he had Billy Cox. There's that power trio from him. I mean, that was being rehearsed September, October, November, you know, during that period.
Right.
Down at Baggies, you know. So that's the next step in Jimmy's musical evolvement. And for whatever reason, after the fact, we all know it's a fabulous record, and we love it to death. It's a brilliant, brilliant album.
Yeah.
But afterwards, he couldn't. It was a difficult thing for him. Buddy wanted to up his ante and come more to the fore, and Jimmy said, "No, there's only one Jimi Hendrix," you know. So there's that, and there was that pressure, you know. And finally, he decided to bring back Mitch, which I think was a good thing. But this is for a conversation for another day.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I thought I mean, it would have been sort of an interesting. It would have been sort of an interesting thing for Jimmy to have brought in another guitar player, because as you know better than anyone, Jimmy's studio recordings were getting more and more layered. I mean, you know, what I call the Cry of Love record is almost like there's like almost a guitar quartet going.
Yeah, that's true. So my feeling is that, as it might have been nice to have had another guitar player, the trio was still the way to go, because I mean, Jimmy's playing lead and rhythm at the same time. But I think it's really important that we look at other acts that I've recorded live, and we may be having a little, so I'm talking, and I know that you are slightly frozen there for a second, but there you go. I think it was important that Jimmy experimented with that, because he always wanted to have more musicians. But at the same time, you know, the experience was it. Without the experience, he couldn't go out on the road and make money, which is what was driving the whole thing, and driving him crazy at the same time. The studio for him was fantastic, but we can dive into Jimmy in the studio at another point. I've got some questions that I can answer. How was it recording The Who? Incredible, very exciting, and one of the greatest shows. I thought they were magnificent. Microphones get knocked over. What are you going to do? They're 58, so they can take it.
Was that sort of the standard go-to mic for Woodstock? Was the 58?
There was nothing else. There was nothing else. It was just 58s on everything, because they were indestructible. I mean, you can hammer nails with the bloody things.
I was curious because I've never heard you talk about this, but you recorded Eric Clapton and Derek and the Dominoes live. Do you have any recollection of that experience and what it was like working with Eric?
It was kind of remote in the sense I don't even remember it. I may have bumped into him backstage quickly and said hello, whatever. But once again, bring in the truck, plug it in, and record. I don't think I ended up mixing it. In fact, I'm pretty sure I didn't. I know I recorded it, that's for sure. I just think that Clapton at that time, I don't know what he was looking for, but that was a wonderful place for him to be. That record is still thought of as a classic.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
mean, his tone, his delivery, the band itself. I mean, tell me about that rhythm section.
Yeah, I mean, Carl Radle, amazing.
Love
I
that
mean,
man.
you worked with those guys on another great live record, Joe Cocker's Mad Dogs and Englishmen. Talk about a big band. That was a big band. What was it like recording that record?
That I have a lot of memories. It probably was the largest assembly of musicians on one stage at the Fillmore East that I can remember recording. Anyway, you got two drummers, you got this incredible bass player. You have Joe Cocker with all the girls singing, and then the families of all of the various musicians and their kids are all towards the end. They're all on stage, and it was wonderful musical mayhem. The feel of the room was incredible. The audience were just eating it up. Cocker was doing his wonderful spastic stuff that he always did, but he was that voice. It was one of the most.
Leon Russell, who was the music director, was one of the great musicians of the era.
Now we're talking about a genius. I mean, that guy, he was the mastermind behind the whole thing. You see him sitting at the piano there with the long hair and the hat and everything. Damn, did he have it under control. He whipped that thing together.
I'm going to go for sort of one wrap-up question here. I'm sort of, what about recording live from your point of view? Is that exciting for you? Is that a thrill? Is that a pain in the butt? What is that? That seems to be it's a different art form than recording in the studio. Do you love doing that?
I love it. I haven't done a live recording in a little while.
Yeah.
Because nowadays people, the bands just bring their own Pro Tools unit and just plug it in and away you go. But there is something about when you work with a band carefully and you think about, okay, we're going to do these two shows at this place, and I know the material, I planned it out, I know exactly how I'm going to record them, and I get the sound while I'm doing it. I've set them up during rehearsal, I've got all my tones together, so later on I don't have to sit there scratching my head, what am I going to do? No, the sound is right there. Classic example of that is recording Zeppelin at Madison Square Garden. It was so exciting. And that's the thing. You have this one chance, that night to get it right. And the next night, please God, you should have a second night. You really need a second night to cross-cut things. But the feeling you get in the room, it's like nothing else. You feel like, I'm a member of this band. And I want to make sure that the band knows, just do your show. Don't worry about me. I try to keep the band really nice and quiet about the whole recording. About it. If you knock over a mic, I don't care. You play your show, I'll record it, and most of the time they do.
Yeah. And finally, we sort of all know that when most bands go to record live records, that there's bits and pieces that can be a little bit spotty. Are you usually the guy that also follows up and does sort of patches things up a little bit if a drum part goes missing or wasn't recorded properly?
Well, God help you if a bloody drum part is gone.
Yeah.
Today, yes. Today you can kind of fix that, Pro Tools, but in quote unquote the old days you couldn't. Certainly guitar parts, certainly vocal parts. I mean, it's so easy to do that today. In the past, what would happen, we'd have to repair. I mean, on Frampton Comes Alive, I'm sure there were lots of little punch-ins here and there. Most of that was, I would say, Peter's performance was phenomenal, and so was the band's. There were a few bits and pieces I think that were punched in. I don't mind doing that, because if the performance from the beginning to the end is really great and there's a couple of notes and they're really like, oh, fix it, because it makes the whole performance more enjoyable. You know. Sometimes the audience is a little bit, the performance is great, so maybe you have to layer in a little bit of
a little bit of audience noise to help it out.
Well, the Kiss stuff is that's what we did. We had loops and loops and loops of tape, about 100-foot loops of tape going from the control room into the studio. One would go, and the other would go, and the other one would, hey! And we had them all labeled so we knew which one. I need more.
That's hilarious.
It was great fun.
Well, again, thank you. Thank you, Eddie, for asking me to do this. It's always a great deal of fun talking to you. Next week, Ed will be back. He'll be talking about the Rolling Stones. You'll have a different moderator, but it's the brilliant Bob Merlis, so I don't mind. And again, thank you, Gibson, for sponsoring such a beautiful thing, and thank you guys for your great questions.
Yeah, fabulous questions from everybody. I've got a little announcement also. I'm going to have my own podcast, if you will, and it's called Kramer Talks, and it's on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter. And I believe I've been instructed to say the Instagram is at Real Eddie Kramer, and I believe the Facebook one is self-explanatory, and so is the Twitter one. Hopefully, I've got that right. Being a newbie in this world of digital podcasts, etc. But thank you all from bottom of my heart. You guys have been great. I'm looking forward to next week with Dem Stones. Going to be hilarious too. Thank you very much, Gibson. Everybody at Gibson. Domo arigato.